Your organization probably doesn't have a focus problem. It has a notification architecture problem. Most teams still treat weak focus like a discipline issue, and they act like people just need better habits, more resilience, or another workshop on time management. But the setup is training them to fail. Teams pings, Outlook banners, red badges, presence changes, mobile alerts after hours. The system keeps pulling attention sideways, and then we act surprised when nobody can stay with one thing long enough to finish it properly. So in the next few minutes, I want to show you why M365 defaults push people into reaction mode. We'll look at how that slows decisions, stretches work, and drives meetings up, and what leaders need to change first. If you want calmer, smarter ways to run M365, subscribe, because this is where the model starts to break. The model is broken. Productivity is being measured through responsiveness. The old model sounds harmless. Reply fast, stay visible, keep the chat moving. In most organizations, that still gets read as engagement. If someone answers in 2 minutes, they're seen as switched on, but if they don't, people start wondering where they are. So the system rewards response speed instead of thinking time, and that sounds efficient until you watch what actually happens to the work. Because quick replies and useful output are not the same thing. A person can answer 20 messages before lunch and still move nothing important forward, while another person stays quiet for 90 minutes, finishes the brief, solves the issue, and shortens the whole project. One looks responsive, the other creates progress. Most environments still reward the first one because responsiveness is easier to see. That's where it breaks. When leaders spend the day reacting, decision velocity drops. Not because they aren't busy, but because their attention gets chopped into tiny pieces, and the harder the decision, the more expensive that fragmentation becomes. Good decisions need a little time. They need context. They need the chance to hold competing signals in mind without another banner arriving in the corner of the screen. So what starts as a simple culture of responsiveness turns into a hidden delay system. An issue comes in, someone pings a group, half the team responds. Nobody really decides. A meeting gets booked. Now the work moves slower, even though everyone looked active the whole time. More notifications don't speed decisions up, they delay them. They create movement around the decision instead of movement through it. And one level deeper, the same thing happens to cycle time. Meaningful work, the kind that takes thought, doesn't happen in clean 5-minute slices. Writing, planning, reviewing, structuring, and solving all depend on staying inside the task long enough for the logic to build. But when people keep switching, they don't just lose seconds, they lose continuity, they come back to the work and need to reload where they were, what mattered, what they already ruled out, and what still needs a call. That's why tasks that should take one block of focused effort start stretching across half a day or more. Not because the work got harder, but because the environment keeps breaking the thread. Then teams stop trusting async signals. A message sits unread, a channel gets noisy. Important updates get buried under low-value chatter, so people compensate. They schedule a call, then another one, then a recurring sync because it's easier. This is how meeting hours climb, not from a love of meetings, but from weak signal design. When people can't trust the system to carry the right message at the right time, they switch to live coordination because it feels safer. And that's the trap a lot of M365 environments create by default. They measure presence, speed, and visible activity, while the business actually needs judgment, completion, and clarity. You're using one model to judge performance, but the work depends on another. So the problem isn't just notification volume. It's what constant interruption does to attention, judgment, and the way organizations decide what productive work even is. The neural tax of the ping. The next layer of this problem is psychological. Most people assume a notification only matters if they actually click on it. But that isn't how human attention works. The banner slides in, the alert sounds, the little red badge appears, and your brain has already shifted focus. Even if your hand doesn't move to the mouse, a part of your mind just did. Research into workplace interruptions consistently shows a specific damaging pattern where the cost of the distraction lasts much longer than the distraction itself. Workers in modern offices get interrupted every few minutes, and getting back into a state of deep, focused work can take about 23 minutes. While that doesn't happen for every single task, it happens often enough that the cumulative damage is massive. That is a brutal exchange rate when the interruption only lasted a few seconds, and this is exactly why the common defenses we use for our habits usually fail. I only glanced at the screen. I didn't even open the chat. It was just a quick check to see who it was. That quick check still creates massive cognitive drag. A 2024 study on smartphone pop-ups found that a single notification disrupts your brain's processing power for about 7 seconds. 7 seconds might not sound like a disaster until you stack it across 50 alerts a day, then combine it with the heavy mental lift of trying to think at full depth again. The visible part of the interruption ends quickly, but the mental residue stays behind. That's the part most people miss. Attention doesn't work like a light switch because it actually has momentum. When you are deep into a complex decision, a first draft, or a difficult piece of strategic planning, your brain is holding a massive amount of structure in place. You're balancing assumptions, open questions, and trade-offs all at once. A notification doesn't just pause the moment. It collapses that mental structure, and rebuilding it requires an amount of effort that people rarely account for in their workday. There is also a layer of physiological stress to consider. You will see plenty of big claims online saying every ping causes a spike in cortisol, but the actual scientific evidence for that is a bit mixed. Controlled studies don't always show a massive short-term stress response from a single digital alert, so we should be careful with the hyperbole. However, the broader pattern of real-world work is undeniable, as constant interruptions are directly linked to higher frustration, more pressure, and a fading sense of control over your own time. Even if the biology is complicated, the lived experience of being overwhelmed is very real. I realized this years ago while watching teams defend their chaotic tool setups because nobody was technically forcing them to reply instantly, but they still felt the pull, they still kept checking their feeds, and they still ended every day exhausted without being able to point to one significant thing they actually finished. The pressure wasn't dramatic or loud. It was a low-grade, constant friction that slowly drained their capacity to think. Then you have to add the Zeigarnik effect into the mix. Unfinished tasks stay active in the back of your mind, which is why those little red unread badges are so effective at killing focus. A notification count in Teams or Outlook doesn't just represent information. It represents an open loop that signals something is incomplete, something is waiting for you, something might be going wrong, and something could get worse if you ignore it. Even if you try to stay on your current task, a portion of your brain keeps circling back to that red dot. You don't have to be a compulsive person for this to happen to you. You just have to be human. This is also why shallow productivity feels so satisfying and convincing in the moment. Sending a quick reply gives you immediate closure because the badge disappears, the banner is gone, and you feel like you're being useful. But strategic work never pays off that fast. It requires long, uninterrupted stretches where nothing visible happens for hours, and the quality only shows up much later in the final decision or the finished design. Because of this, people naturally drift toward the work that clears signals rather than the work that actually creates value. One level deeper, we have to admit the tools don't start from a place of calm. They are built for stimulation, so the banners, sounds, badges, and presence indicators are all turned on by default. Mobile push notifications then extend that same loud pattern far beyond the office laptop. The entire system starts at maximum volume, which means focus has to fight for permission instead of being protected by the system. The default settings trap inside Microsoft 365. Now take that universal attention problem and drop it into the standard Microsoft 365 setup that most companies run. When things get messy, people usually start talking about behavior and telling employees to turn things off or set better boundaries. But the digital environment people open every morning is already pushing them in the wrong direction. And if the system defaults keep shouting, personal discipline just becomes a losing battle against bad design. Start by looking at Teams. Teams frequently turns into a live reaction surface because notifications, activity signals, and app mentions stack on top of each other in ways that most companies never think to question. Channels stay noisy, activity feeds never stop moving, and people use mentions for things that aren't urgent or even particularly important. Eventually, people start monitoring the green dot on presence indicators as if it were a formal service-level agreement. You're showing as available. You must have seen my message. You chose not to answer me. That is the broken model behind the behavior. The platform provides incredibly broad visibility, but without a clear hierarchy for signals, that visibility just turns into a constant stream of interruptions. If a user is getting hit with channel activity, direct mentions, and mobile pushes all at the same time, Teams stops being a tool for collaboration and starts acting like a high-pressure system. Once a team normalizes that culture, every single message arrives with the emotional weight of an emergency, even when it's just background noise. Outlook suffers from the exact same problem, though it comes in a more familiar package. Most corporate setups still treat the inbox like a real-time workspace where a new mail lands, a banner pops up, and the day gets split in half once again. Desktop notifications turn every incoming email into a major event, even though the vast majority of mail is just reference traffic, CC clutter, or newsletters that could easily wait. Features like focused inbox and quiet hours exist to help, but in most companies they aren't shaped into a real way of working, so the default remains interrupt first. This matters because email often looks harmless compared to chat. It feels older, more traditional, and less aggressive than a direct message. But if every new piece of mail feels like a physical tap on the shoulder, Outlook becomes just another source of constant task switching. The message isn't just sitting in your inbox anymore, it's in the room with you, sitting right on top of the work you were actually trying to finish. Then we have to look at Viva. Many organizations have access to powerful focus features but never move them from being an optional extra to being the actual working norm. People can book focus time on their own, but they have to remember to do it and then defend that time in a culture that views an open calendar as an invitation to book a meeting. This means the tool for protecting your brain exists, but the default calendar pattern still favors meeting sprawl and constant availability. Focus stays fragile because protecting it is entirely voluntary. SharePoint creates a much quieter version of the same structural issue. It is less obvious than a chat message, but the pattern of distraction is very similar. People subscribe to site alerts over the years, but as projects move and ownership shifts, they keep getting updates from places that no longer matter to their job. Since nobody ever reviews this alert sprawl, the signal quality slowly degrades until something truly important arrives, buried inside a pile of automated noise. Mobile access makes every one of these problems significantly harder to manage. Once the Teams and Outlook badges live on a personal phone, the workday no longer ends when the laptop is closed. Even if an employee doesn't open every single alert, the badge count and the reminder of unfinished work stay with them throughout the evening. Quiet hours and badge removal can help reduce the strain, but if the mobile defaults are left untouched, the platform will keep leaking work into every private moment of the day. This isn't actually a problem with user preference or a lack of willpower. It is a fundamental system design issue. What typically happens is that each app is configured in a vacuum, each user tries to manage their own chaos, and nobody actually owns the attention model for the entire company. Teams sends one signal, Outlook sends another, and SharePoint generates alerts in the background while mobile devices extend the noise. The result is entirely predictable. Signal quality drops, urgency is fake, and people lose trust in their digital environment. If every single notification is treated as important, then nothing is actually important. Once that environment becomes the norm, the organization starts paying for that noise twice. They pay for it first in the form of constant interruptions, and then they pay for it again in recovery behavior, like more checking, more chasing, and more unnecessary meetings. The real question isn't how people can cope with the noise better, but rather, what part of the system do you change first? The business cost leaders actually feel. Once you recognize the pattern in these tools, a much more serious question comes up. What is this actually costing the business? I'm not talking about vague wellness language or employee happiness metrics. I mean the hard operating terms that leaders track and get judged on every single quarter. It starts with decision velocity. Imagine a team raises a critical issue on a Monday morning. Technically, the right people are informed because the thread exists, the files are attached, and the data is sitting right there. But in reality, nobody can hold the entire problem in their head long enough to move it toward a clean decision. Their attention keeps getting pulled into side traffic, parallel messages, and low-value response loops that look like activity but never actually close the loop. What should have been handled in one pass turns into weeks of drift. This isn't happening because people aren't trying hard enough. The problem is the environment itself, which breaks human judgment into tiny fragments, and fragmented judgment is always slow judgment. In those moments, leaders don't need more status updates or more data points. They need enough uninterrupted space to actually think and decide. That is a specific structural requirement, yet most M365 setups do absolutely nothing to protect it. Then you have to look at cycle time. This is where the real cost hides inside normal work. A deliverable doesn't usually stall in an obvious dramatic way, it just moves badly. A proposal takes 3 days longer than it should, or a review comes back late, or a plan gets reopened because someone lost the thread and needs the context explained for the third time. The calendar looks full and the chat looks busy, but completion dates keep stretching. Every time someone restarts a task, they pay a reload time tax that never shows up on a dashboard as waste. It just looks like slow execution. Eventually, leaders start asking why capable, high-paid teams need so much longer to finish work they already know how to do. The answer usually isn't a lack of effort, it's interruption density. This leads directly to the explosion of meeting hours. This part is critical because it looks like a coordination problem, but the deeper issue is a total lack of trust in the signal layer. If people stop believing that the right message will reach the right person at the right time, they stop relying on digital channels entirely. They book a meeting instead. A quick check-in becomes a 30-minute call, and a status note becomes a recurring sync. Decisions that should live in a thread get dragged into a live meeting because being in the same room feels safer than trusting a noisy, unreliable system. When the digital signal fails, meetings fill the gap. For IT and operations teams, this cost takes a different form. A flood of minor alerts eventually buries the few notifications that actually matter. Once that happens, the mean time to resolution starts to suffer because engineers are forced to sort through noise before they can even see the event that requires action. While public data on M365 specific notification ROI is still thin, the pattern is obvious in any overloaded environment. Alert sprawl kills trust, and when trust disappears, response times slow down. That pressure lands hardest on the people at the top. It isn't one big decision that breaks a leader. It's the endless, low-grade friction that steals the mental energy they need for high-level strategy. Research from Harvard Business Review suggests that executive fatigue grows less from the weight of big decisions and more from the sheer frequency and unpredictability of interruptions. It isn't one dramatic moment that ruins a day. It's the constant nagging pull of the ping. Attention isn't some soft HR topic. It is your primary operating capacity. If you burn that capacity on reaction, the business pays for it through slower decisions, longer cycle times, and weaker execution across the board. Once you frame it that way, governance stops sounding like a set of restrictions. It starts sounding like basic essential infrastructure. The case: what changed in one global services environment? To make this concrete, let's look at a real anonymized environment where the operating pattern actually shifted. This was a global services firm with about 8,000 users. They had a high collaboration load, heavy client coordination, and constant internal handoffs. The same complaint kept surfacing from every department. People felt like they had no space to think. This wasn't just junior staff complaining, managers and delivery leads felt it too. The issue wasn't a lack of information, they had plenty of that, but the fact that useful info arrived mixed with constant noise. Their attention stayed spread thin from 9 to 5. The baseline was a mess. Knowledge workers were getting between 120 and 180 notifications every day across Teams, Outlook, and mobile devices. On average, their meeting load sat at about 6.5 hours a day. That left almost zero protected time for the real work like proposals, planning, or decision prep. Work was still moving, but it moved through fragmentation. People answered things, they attended things, and they chased updates, while the harder, more valuable work got pushed into the evening. They ran an intervention for 60 days, and the most interesting part is that the changes weren't even that complex. First, they reset the team's defaults. The baseline moved toward direct mentions and replies, rather than broad activity noise, and they tightened the rules on when someone could use a channel-wide at mention. They turned off Outlook desktop pop-ups entirely. Then, they ran a simple rules campaign to separate low-value automated mail from messages that actually required human judgment. It wasn't about inbox zero theater. It was just about cleaner routing. Next, they rolled out Viva focus blocks, starting with a few pilot groups. This wasn't presented as a nice-to-have feature for the employees. The goal was to create protected work periods that appeared on the calendar to normalize the idea that focused time is a part of delivery, not time stolen from it. They also introduced mobile quiet hours at night so that work stopped leaking into every spare minute of a person's life. But the biggest change wasn't technical at all. Leadership officially removed the expectation of an instant response unless a case was clearly marked as urgent. That single policy decision was the most important part of the whole project. The tools only changed behavior once the social rules changed with them. Without that shift, people would have kept interrupting themselves just to prove they were still online and working. With the new rule in place, the technical settings actually started to hold. Within 90 days, the results were undeniable. Notification volume dropped by nearly 45%, and meeting hours came down by 18% across the board. Each user gained about 2.1 hours of focus time per week. The outcome the leaders cared about most wasn't just that people felt calmer, though they certainly did. It was that Project SLA movement improved significantly. This proved that designing for attention had changed the actual execution of the business, not just the mood of the office. This matters because the gain didn't come from people working harder or lowering their standards. The gain came from removing the constant interruption that had been pretending to be coordination for years. Once those defaults changed, people didn't have to fight their environment just to concentrate. The system stopped fighting them. If your current setup creates drag by default, the fix has to be just as structural. You need an attention baseline. The new model, build an attention baseline for M365. The shift is simple to describe even if it takes real discipline to actually implement. You need to treat notifications the same way you treat security baselines. That means they are intentional, governed, and reviewed regularly rather than being left to random user choices across the entire tenant. Most organizations would never dream of letting every employee invent their own MFA policy. But when it comes to attention, that is basically what happens. Everyone starts with a noisy, cluttered environment, and then the burden shifts to the individual to try and clean it up. That model simply does not scale. It starts with teams. For most users, the default setting should move toward mentions and replies only, while broad channel activity needs to be reduced unless a specific role actually requires it. Wide-reaching mentions like @channel or @team should never be casual habits, so you should restrict them, or at least tighten the rules on who can use them and when. The activity feed also needs a lot less worship because it looks useful just because it's full, but volume is not the same thing as clarity. A quieter feed with cleaner escalation paths gives your people a much better sense of what actually needs a response right now. Outlook needs the same kind of reset. You should disable desktop pop-ups by default because that one change alone removes a steady, exhausting stream of visual interruptions throughout the workday. Then you need to align quiet hours with Teams, so users don't have one app going silent while another one keeps poking them for attention. After that, start using rules for basic triage so that FYI traffic, newsletters, and broad CC emails stop landing with the same weight as mail that requires actual judgment. The point here isn't to hide information from people, but rather to stop presenting every single data point as something immediate. Viva should stop being treated like a personal productivity extra that people can just ignore. If your team has access to focus time, you need to use it as a core part of the operating model. Auto-book at least 2 hours a day where possible and protect those blocks from the usual meeting sprawl that tends to take over a calendar. Not every role can defend every single block every day, and that's fine because this isn't about purity, it's about baseline design. A protected block that holds up 3 days a week is still infinitely better than a calendar that never gives deep thinking work a place to live. Then you have to clean up SharePoint alerts. Only keep alerts active for libraries or spaces where a change genuinely matters to the workflow. If users need repeated updates from a specific process, move that into a better automated workflow instead of training everyone to sit under a constant rain of generic notifications. Power Automate can carry structured updates far better than unmanaged alert sprawl ever will, and the aim is simple. Fewer signals, but better signals. Mobile needs a much firmer stance than most companies are currently willing to give it. Set strict quiet hours and remove those red notification badges for Teams and Outlook as a recommended baseline for the staff. You should keep a priority path open for true escalation because sometimes something really is urgent, but you have to define exactly what that path looks like. Don't let the entire mobile surface impersonate urgency all day and all night, or your people will never actually disconnect. Then you add the policy layer that most people usually skip. What deserves a ping? What belongs in an asynchronous channel? What can wait until the next scheduled working block? Those rules matter just as much as the technical settings because people misuse tools when the social meaning of a signal stays vague. Visibility is not the same thing as noise, and speed is not the same thing as interruption, but personal settings alone won't fix a pattern that the organization designed into the environment. You are going to hear resistance. Some people will tell you they need real-time visibility, but usually what they actually need is filtered visibility. Others will claim this slows the business down, even though the current setup is already slowing things by scattering everyone's attention across the day. And then some will insist that users should just manage this for themselves, but if that actually worked, you wouldn't be dealing with overload across the whole system right now. So the new model is not about silence, it is about signal quality. And this only becomes real when leaders make one clear move next. Define what urgent actually means, set the baseline across M365, and then measure what changes in decisions, delivery, and meeting load. So the shift is this: stop treating responsiveness as proof of performance. This week, I want you to audit your notification architecture across Teams, Outlook, Viva, SharePoint, and mobile. Then ask 3 very direct questions. What is actually urgent? Who gets to decide that? And what can wait without creating real damage? After you have those answers, pick one pilot group and apply a simple baseline. Reduce the broad alerts, protect the focus blocks, align the quiet hours, and tighten up those escalation rules. Then you just need to measure what happens after 30 days in terms of decision speed, cycle time, and total meeting hours. That gives you something much better than just an opinion. It gives you operating evidence. And if this changed how you think about focus and modern work, leave a review, as it really helps more people find the show. You can also connect with me, Mirko Peters, on LinkedIn and tell me exactly where notification noise is breaking your teams. In the next episode, I'll get into the policy layer and show you how to implement it without slowing the business down too much.